So I'm pleased to introduce our farming case studies. We've got Henry Edmunds, who manages the Cholderton estate in Wiltshire, Nicolette Hahn Niman, who brings a US ranch perspective, Simon Fairlie, who is a writer and runs a microdairy in Dorset, and Richard Williamson, who's the managing director of Beeswax Dyson farming who farm in Lincolnshire, Gloucestershire, and in Oxfordshire. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to tell us a bit about how they've addressed climate change. The first three will do presentations, and then I'm going to have a conversation with Richard Williamson at the end. And then after that, hopefully we'll have some time for some questions from the floor. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Henry. Henry's has been managing the family estate in Wiltshire since 1975, and he's been building his knowledge and passion for nature and wildlife with a string of awards to his name. So he's well placed to explain how he has introduced climate change into his management. Henry.
To introduce you to the organic farming enterprise at Cholderton, I can summarise as follows. There are 2 herds of Frisian dairy cows of around 120 each. All calves are retained and kept either as herd replacements or sold as stores or finished cattle. There is also a flock of around 350 ewes producing top quality early lambs. We practice a lay farming system. All fertility is generated by the decomposition of animal manures and from the utilisation of herbal lays comprised partly of deep-rooting legumes. These lays are dominated by sainfoin, lucerne, and red and white clover. The grasses meadowfescue, timothy, and cocksfoot are added to the mix. 500 acres of arable crops are grown. These include winter oats, spring barley, and a mix of oats and vetches, autumn sown for arable silage. The oats and vetches are followed by a summer sown crop of stubble turnips, which is succeeded after grazing by a spring barley crop undersown with a lay mixture in the following year. As the herbal lays become tired, generally after 5 years or so, they are ploughed and succeeded by 2 cereal crops. No weed control or fertilizers are required, the crops being sufficiently clean and fertile to give reasonable yields. I would expect winter oats to exceed 2¼ tonnes per acre and spring barley 2 tonnes per acre in a normal year. The cereals are then ground and fed back to our livestock. We retain some for our own seed. This is a traditional approach to farm management and one with which my great-grandfather was familiar 140 years ago. There is an area of around 500 acres, mostly on the side of a steep line of hills with very thin soils. This was historically sheep grazed down, but was ploughed during the war. It was very suitable to return to downland, and this was achieved with the assistance of the Countryside Stewardship Scheme. This has been a great success, with a wide range of downland plants present and several species of butterfly, including the Adonis blue, the Chalkhill blue, and the Duke of Burgundy fritillary, returning to breed in areas where they have not been seen for 70 years. Last year, I was asked to work with FTech, an accountancy practice specialising in the economic and environmental implications of differing rural land management techniques. FTech evaluate the natural capital and the public goods generated by a farm. This is judged by examining the ecosystems, clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, as well as the farm's productivity in terms of food and landscape value. FTech found that over a 50-year period, a conventional farm of our size would generate a loss of £8.8 million in terms of environmental damage, whilst we would accrue a benefit of £500,000 over the same period. This demonstrates that our farming practice is ecologically sustainable. Looking at the issue of groundwater, conventional arable farmers are under little restriction with the use of nitrogenous fertilizers. Nitrate-vulnerable zone regulations merely state that no more nitrate should be used than the crop requires. Farmers may not wish to waste nitrogen, but regardless of this, as crops have become depleted in organic matter, more nitrate is leached into groundwater, and more is lost to the atmosphere. Half of all applied artificial nitrate is wasted. I run a small water company supplying drinking water to just over 2,000 people in the surrounding area. Some 30 years ago, I became aware that nitrate levels in our water were increasing year on year, and that in 25 years we would be near or over the World Health Organization's limit of 50 milligrams per litre of nitrate in drinking water. I informed the National Rivers Authority of my concerns, but action was not taken. I turned the farm over to an organic system to try and mitigate these nitrate levels and stem the increase. My efforts had little effect. Subsequent testing by the Environment Agency established that the nitrates in our water were not originating on our farm, but upstream and were derived from nitrogenous fertilizers and effluent from sewage treatment works. The EA study demonstrated that the very low nitrate generation from our stock, less than 50 kilograms per hectare, was not contaminating groundwater, and that we were therefore benefiting other water abstractors further downstream. It is currently costing our water companies some £50,000 a year to remove nitrates originating from these other sources. Our organic methods are therefore generating a substantial public benefit in this area alone. A further example is evident from carbon sequestration. This is the process by which carbon is removed from the atmosphere and locked into herbaceous material, incorporated manures, trees, and the roots of leguminous plants. Soils hold twice as much carbon as the atmosphere. If one can increase soil carbon by 10%, then atmospheric carbon will reduce by 20%. Sainfoin, which has been grown at Cholderton since 1730, is a remarkable example of this. It is a highly nutritious plant which has 4 times as much root as lucerne and is the most drought-resistant plant that can be grown in the UK. Legumes, especially sainfoin, with their deep roots, associated microbes and mycorrhiza, are building a soil bank of trapped carbon whilst improving soil structure, fertility, and organic matter simultaneously. 1 metre depth of soil containing just 1% of carbon is equivalent to 100 tonnes of carbon per acre. It is possible to increase this to 250 tonnes per acre utilising deep-rooting legumes. Here we have a key which, if turned in the right direction, can help arrest global warming. Human activity in the UK generates some 454 million tonnes of CO2 a year. Around 14% of this is derived from agricultural emissions from intensive arable land. If a rotational ley system incorporating legumes was encouraged, with a third of the 3.9 million arable hectares growing pasture legumes, then 325 million tonnes of CO2 could be sequestered. Furthermore, replacing the current temporary grasslands with leguminous leys could sequester a further 200 million tonnes of carbon with no loss of productivity and no further need for artificial nitrate applications. Current conventional agricultural practice is depleting the soil of carbon, organic matter is being lost, and natural fertility eroded. Agrochemicals are eradicating soil microorganisms and wildlife generally. We have all been deceived by distorted ideology promoted by the agrochemical companies. What solutions can they offer to address climate change? They have none. Ecological organic farming can demonstrate simple solutions to climate change which have global implications. The UK had a far more sustainable agricultural industry in the 1950s and 60s than it has now. There were then 2 million hectares of temporary grass compared to just 0.9 million hectares today. The winding up of the Milk Marketing Board, and this together with the misapplication of subsidies, has been a major factor. Absurdly, grassland was not eligible for support, but arable land was, no doubt due to the lobbying by vested interests. The MMB was set up to ensure that milk was made available to consumers for a reasonable price and that farmers received a fair return. As a consequence, dairy farms were spread all over the country, and a mixed farming system with its rich wildlife and tapestry landscape prevailed. With the demise of the MMB, dairy farms were thrown into the rapacious hands of the big retailers. They paid as little as they could, imported milk to exert further downward pressure on prices, and then to top it all, sold milk as a loss leader in their stores for less than the price of water. Looking at the price my father received for his milk in the 1970s and allowing for inflation, the price of conventional milk should be today 70 pence per litre. Low prices and lack of support have forced mixed farms to adopt an all-arable system. This was brilliant for the agrochemical multinational companies, but disastrous for the environment. Some of the dairy farms that remain have only survived by adopting industrial methods where excessive numbers of cows are kept in sheds, never feel the sun on their backs, and are milked 3 times a day. Their bull calves are shot at birth, and the cows only achieve 3 lactations before they themselves are slaughtered due to problems with feet, fertility, or mastitis. It is a shocking indictment of a cheap food policy. Worst of all, prodigious yields of milk given by these wretched and overexploited cows are only possible due to a major part of their diet being composed of soya grown in the ashes of the Amazonian rainforest. Thus, unsustainable practice here is directly promoting environmental destruction. What of the cost to animal welfare, the environment, let alone to the families who have lost their farms and their beloved cows? It is a fallacy to believe that low food prices are a public benefit when they are incentivizing deforestation in any part of the world. I sometimes feel that our society has made us participants in a failed economic experiment. It seems that further economic growth in the West is neither desirable or even feasible. Should success be measured in a ceaseless acquisition of soon-to-be discarded consumables? Perhaps we and our children should learn not to place such importance on acquisitive consumerism and look instead more to the reconstruction of a broken environment and a stable global community. It is clear that world trading agreements are no longer fit for the purpose. Shipping alone is responsible for some 30% of global CO2 emissions and is hence a major driver of global warming and climate change. Consumers and traders may benefit from the movement of goods from lower-cost economies to ours, but this can be unfair to manufacturers and farmers in our own country. Here, waste and emissions are strictly regulated. Regulation increases the cost of production and hence the price of the completed product. Why is the importation of similar goods from another part of the world permitted where no environmental regulations are enforced? By importing goods from farmers and manufacturers not subject to regulatory control, we have generated a distortion in the trading cycle, which operates directly against our own farmers and manufacturers and encourages a process of environmental degradation subsidized by our consumers. All businesses in the trading nations could be subjected to a global impact assessment covering the cost of production and shipping of goods from one market to another. This would, as a desktop exercise, estimate the environmental cost of the product, this to be added to the price of that product as a tax in the receiving market. This would encourage better protection for the environment and the living and working conditions of those workers involved. This tax could fund measures to reconstruct the forests and wild places that have been so mutilated by humanity. The universal application of sustainable ecological principles to agriculture is essential to combat climate change. Embracing lay farming and developing a form of parochial self-sufficiency where locally grown feed is fed to local livestock and where local food is sold to local people is the way forward. We must achieve a degree of compatibility and balance with the limited resources of our planet. Sustainability, not necessarily economic growth, should be the focus of our and future generations. It is by adopting a fresh approach and a different economic doctrine that the planet can be safeguarded for the future. Remember, farmers and policymakers, decisions that you make on a day-by-day basis will impact directly upon the health and vitality of the living world. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. A very unique perspective, well, possibly not so unique, certainly from the applause there. I'd now like to introduce Nicolette Hahn Niman, who is from America. Nicolette has a ranch in Northern California, but is best known for her book called Defending Beef. She's an active campaigner for reform of the intensive livestock production and a drive for sustainable food. So, Nicolette, can I hand you the microphone?
I'm so happy to be here, and I've been so enthralled with all the comments and the presentations this morning. I can't tell you, my head is bursting with ideas, and it's so different than the conversation that's taking place in the US. I feel like you are at least 10 years ahead of us. So that's my first bit of information. Great going, keep it up. You're inspiring all of us in the US. And yet there are some things we are doing well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those things. And Patrick asked me to talk a little bit about my own story, so I'm going to do that, and so that you know where I'm coming from, and talk a little bit about what we're doing on our particular ranch. And actually, I put a slide of my husband and me up to start, because really, since I was asked to speak about the business of farming, I really have to talk a lot about my husband, because he's really the business person in our partnership and has been a real pioneer in terms of sustainable food production. So his name is Bill Niman, and I'm going to talk about him quite a bit today. So we have a ranch in Northern California, just north of San Francisco. Those of you who have been to California might know Marin County. We are in Marin County, we're right on the coast, and just north of San Francisco. We can actually see the city of San Francisco from our ranch, so we're very close. And we raise primarily beef cattle, and we call ourselves a ranch. I was asked this question a couple of days ago here in the UK, why I use the word ranch. In the US, if you're in the western half of the United States and you have grass and livestock, you call yourselves a ranch. And if you plow the ground, you call yourself a farm, essentially. So that's basically the difference. And we have cattle, most of all, and then we have older breeds, heritage breeds of turkeys. And they're also out on pasture every day. And the reason I'm involved in this work at all is because I was an environmental attorney. I worked for 10 years as a lawyer. And the last several years, I was working for environmental groups. And I was hired by Bobby Kennedy Jr. to work for the group Waterkeeper that he was the head of, to be the senior attorney for the group. And he really wanted me to focus on the livestock and the agricultural industry, but especially the livestock industry, and the pollution that the large concentrated operations were causing. And so I spent a lot of time researching that and going around and looking at large operations and looking at pollution issues around the United States caused by large agricultural operations, but especially confinement hog operations and confinement chicken operations. But very soon into the project, I approached Bobby and I said, I really think we don't want to be against agriculture or against meat, because we're not, and that doesn't provide a solution. And so we began to have a very significant facet of the project that I was starting being about advocating for good practices and good methods that would really be environmentally beneficial. And I did that work for 2 years, full-time. That was my full-time focus, was the livestock industry and its ecological effects, good or bad. And I became very convinced through that 2 years, from a lot of going around the country and looking in operations and actually being involved in litigation. I was the lead attorney on several large lawsuits against operations like Smithfield that had huge hog confinement operations that were dumping raw pig waste into the waterways and things like that. And I became very convinced that there was a tremendous dichotomy between the large industrial operations and the environmental and health effects they were causing, and the animal welfare in particular, and really good farms. And the farms I started working with a lot and seeing and getting very excited about were part of the network that Bill Niman had started. They were part of a network of farmers called Niman Ranch. And the Niman Ranch farmers are all farmers, they're spread around the United States. Many of them are raising pigs mostly, and are concentrated in the upper Midwestern part of the United States, so like Iowa especially, but also Illinois and Ohio and Michigan. And these are all people raising their pigs on pasture, and most of them have diverse operations as well. And they were doing something very, very different from what the mainstream large-scale confinement operations were doing in the rest of the United States, which is the vast majority of the production in the United States. And the Niman Ranch farmers are also raising beef, the ranchers, and lamb. And what was really interesting about the Niman Ranch network is that they were essentially creating a way to aggregate their products by having common standards. None of this is government set, by the way. This is all set by the individuals and the private company, the association of farmers that make up the company. But they created standards, working with the Animal Welfare Institute for animal welfare, and they had environmental standards and many other aspects of standards in terms of how the farms should function in the community and with respect to the land and with respect to the animals and the food, and also very strict standards at slaughter as well. And it was really telling the story of the food and telling the story of the farmers and the animals and differentiating the product through that storytelling. And that was what was making Niman Ranch so unique and so notable. And the product that Niman Ranch farmers were producing was always a great deal more expensive because, as you all know, when you don't benefit from the lack of environmental enforcement that all the large confinement operations were benefiting from and other things, they were not passing their costs onto society through polluted waterways and health problems and poor animal welfare. They were truly taking good care of their land and their animals and producing a high quality eating product, very high eating quality product as well. And that was what was getting a lot of attention in the United States for the Niman Ranch food and the standards. And in actually, maybe we'll go to the next slide there. Yeah, so then there's an interesting twist to my story. So I was an environmental lawyer for Bobby Kennedy in New York, as I mentioned, and I met Bill Niman, who's in this slide as well. And you can tell we're very well acquainted in these pictures that I've put up. By the time these pictures are taken, we were married. And but the way that came to pass, I was working as an environmental lawyer and a vegetarian and living in New York City. And I met Bill and started working with all the farmers. And increasingly, I fell in love with the farming methods and then the farmer, ultimately. And so then I became the wife of a farmer. But when I first moved to the ranch from New York, I really thought, well, I'll just be an environmental lawyer and I'm a vegetarian and I clearly am not ever going to work on the ranch. But I was sort of drawn into it and fell very much in love with it. And at one point, about 6 months into our marriage, I declared to my husband that I wanted to start working on the ranch. And he was so shocked he almost fell out of his chair because he thought his urban vegetarian lawyer wife would never make that declaration. But for the next 7 years, I actually became our primary laborer on our ranch. And I wrote a book during that time period called Righteous Pork Chop, which is my first book, which is kind of an indictment of the industrial methods of farming and an argument for the more ecologically and more animal-friendly and human-friendly methods. And after writing that book, and then we had a couple of kids, 2 boys, one of whom has been serving your drinks. You might have noticed a 10-year-old boy going around. That's my older son, Miles. But I started being in the house a lot more and less out on the ranch. And I wrote a second book at that point because I realized that there had become this bizarre contortion in the public discussion about livestock, where they were strictly viewed as a negative entity from the environmental perspective. And that's always been out there for a long time, but it really sort of was reaching this fevered pitch with respect to climate change. And I wrote the book Defending Beef because I wanted to lay out the case for not just sort of we can mitigate the damage, because that's how a lot of the environmental groups will talk about this issue, but to say that they actually are essential in an ecological food system. And in fact, we need animals in an ecologically optimal food system. And that's the case that I made in the Defending Beef book. So there's one more picture I wanted to show. This is in about 2010, I think it was, we decided to shift entirely to grass for we raise turkeys as well, as I mentioned, and of course they're omnivores, so we do provide them some feed, but they're out on grass every day. But the beef, of course, are animals that can thrive and will thrive on good forage. So we began raising totally grass-fed beef. We shifted gradually, and Bill left the Niman Ranch company that he had founded, and we started another company. But what was really compelling to us, the reason we moved entirely towards grass-fed beef, was because we were really becoming persuaded through what we were reading and hearing and learning in lots of different venues, that both the nutritional case for totally grass-fed beef was very, very compelling, and the ecological case. And so we started focusing on our grazing practices and making sure that our cattle were the right age and the right size when they went to slaughter and the right maturity. So all of our cattle are much older than most of the typical grass, or even grass-fed beef, but also conventional grain-fed beef in the United States. And we experimented with the ages and ended up settling on an average of around 26 months, typically, 24 to 26 months. A lot of our animals were open heifers that did not get pregnant in the normal process. I think I'm getting a signal. Okay, I've got a little bit, just a few more seconds, I think. Okay, a couple more minutes, good. And so we developed, my husband is very well known in the United States for the eating quality of the meat in particular. So he was very interested in creating the optimal eating quality of the meat. And he spent quite a bit of time trying different age cattle slaughtered at different times of year and sending it to really good chefs that he was friends with and getting their opinion about the eating quality. And we reached the consensus from working with all these chefs over a period of a couple of years actually doing this, that we should only slaughter our animals when they were mature, fully mature, and fat, and also in season. And so for us, because we have seasonal, our climate is kind of unique. We have what's called a Mediterranean climate where it only rains for a few months of the year, and that is in the winter. And then the rest of the time it's dry. So we slaughter all of our animals every year at the time when they're fully fat from naturally occurring vegetation. We don't, interestingly, it's I think quite different than most of the UK. We don't do anything to our fields except for graze them. We do not irrigate, we do not apply any chemicals, any fertilizer, any kind of pharmaceutical input, nothing. And they're not given any kind of pharmaceutical input. But we do vaccinate. That was an interesting question. It's something that I wonder about as well. But basically, the health of our grasslands and the health of our animals is all about that pasture management. And that's something that we're increasingly focused on. But one thing that occurred to me today as I was listening to all of the talks is that I don't really think that we on our farm, our ranch, are really the pioneers of the best regenerative practices. I was sort of mentioned earlier that we would be the people doing that, and I wouldn't put myself in that category. Because we are doing a fairly standard rotational grazing sort of practice, and we feel we're doing a very good job with that, but I feel we could do a lot better. And one of the things I've realized is we are not full-time ranchers, neither my husband or I. We're both very involved in the meat side of the business and other things. And it's really the people I know in the United States that are fully focused on the farm side of it and working full-time as farmers that are doing the most exciting ecologically regenerative practices, and I would put Gabe Brown at the very top of the list. We've been talking about him already the last couple days. He's a farmer in North Dakota that has diverse, he went from a totally conventional crop operation to a very diversified, multi-species operation. And the really interesting thing about Gabe Brown is that he says that not only could he not do what he does without, and he's reduced all of his chemical inputs down to nothing now, but he says he couldn't do it without animals, but he has actually increased the number of animals every year. And he sees that as an essential component of creating this truly ecologically diverse and resilient system. So I just wanted to mention that as well, that I think that I hope the energy and the conversation in this room leads to really great things. I think it will. I am very excited for what's happening in regenerative agriculture right now, and I think that you all in this room are very much on track. So, good work. Keep it going.
Thank you, Nicolette. That was really fascinating. Thank you. Next, we're moving on to Simon Fairlie. Simon is a champion of the small and sustainable and does not subscribe to economies of scale, I would say. He is a worker, he's a writer, he runs a microdairy in Dorset, and he brings quite a unique perspective. So, Simon, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I'm at the opposite end of the landowning spectrum from the previous speakers. I run a microdairy on 10 acres of rough hilly pasture. I have 3 cows. They produce 10,000 litres of milk between them, plus 2 or 3 calves a year. I do get £1.20 a litre for my milk, which is a bit better than some. Microdairies are becoming a bit fashionable, but in fact, the one I run has been going since 1941 and is probably the oldest one of its size in the country. But the way it works is that I provide all the milk, yogurt, and cheese, and ice cream for an educational institution that's feeding, on average, 30 people a day, mostly in the summer, more in the summer than the winter. That's where the bulk of my market is, but some of there is a surplus which gets sold outside, mostly as halloumi. I venture to think that this is quite a good operation, albeit small, on the kind of carbon emission front, because, well, for a start, I have 100 food yards in respect of the delivery of the milk. The milk, that's from the milking parlour to the point of sale, retail sale. I have 0 packaging. It's put into churns in the milking parlour and sold in the churns 100 yards away. I use 0 chemicals on the land, near 0 machinery. I have employed a tractor driver twice in 9 years, and I might move away from that, but for reasons. And also produce enough manure to fertilise a 1-acre vegetable garden. So that's what I do. It's a part-time. Well, I like to think it's part-time. It can take over a bit in the summer. And I make my own hay with the help. Oh, and I benefit from people who actually like working with their hands rather than in gyms helping me. Now, I'm not arguing that this is, that the size of this is anything particularly to be emulated. I'm not an advocate. I do advocate small farms, but I'm not saying that all farms should be just 3 cows, of course. But I do think that this kind of model is replicable in certain cases on a larger scale, typically for schools and other educational institutions, hospitals, prisons, and so forth. This could be scaled up to do much a similar sort of operation, providing all the milk products and obviously, particularly with schools, there's an advantage in terms of education of the kids. With hospitals, there's an advantage in terms of the health of the food. So that's my business case. It wasn't actually what I was asked to talk about, so I'm going to go and move it a little bit further away from that. and look at the macro implications of this. About 11 years ago, I wrote a paper called Can Britain Feed Itself?, in which I compared a number of different management systems, chemical, organic, vegan, livestock, etc. The one I preferred was one where a quite extensive agriculture, well, not necessarily extensive, but it produced an organic livestock. I established that it could feed the whole of Britain on a bit of a squeeze with 7.9 million hectares of arable and 5.9 of pasture. That included about a quarter of all the calories coming from livestock, and of that quarter, half of that was from dairy. You did use more land than, for example, chemical farming. It's a lot more land than chemical vegan farming, no doubt about it. But it's still doable, which for an overpopulated country like ours is interesting to say the least. It was a bit of a back-of-an-envelope job, and I hope that some proper academics would take it up and pursue this further, which they haven't really done. Zero Carbon Britain has done something on those lines. There's a study of Swedish agriculture which is on those lines. Scandinavian agriculture, but nothing has been followed up on that in England. However, there's one interesting aspect of it. There were several, but the one I want to focus on today is that I could not make the organic agriculture work with high-yielding Holstein-type cows. I just couldn't reduce the land use to something that was feasible. And there were three reasons for this. The first was that they required arable for concentrates to get their high yields. Secondly, there were fewer replacement calves were needed because the hardier grass-fed cows that I was advocating weren't replaced after 3 or 4 years. And perhaps most importantly, because there are fewer cows in the dairy system, in our intensive Holstein dairy system, fewer calves are produced, which meant that in order to maintain a beef herd, you had to run a suckler herd that you wouldn't have otherwise had to run. And so what this meant was that basically, the thing about suckler cows is they're pretty inefficient. With all due respect to beef farmers here, compared to dairy cows, the suckler cow industry is pretty inefficient. It produces 1 cow for 1 calf a year, whereas a dairy industry, a dairy calf, produces 1 calf plus umpteen litres a year. Now, if you come back to my holding of 10 acres, it produces 10,000 litres. That's 1,000 litres an acre. And that 1,000 litres is pretty much sufficient nutrient to feed 1 person, right? In fact, it's slightly less on the calories, but considerably more on the protein and on the fat. So my 10 acres is feeding the equivalent of 10 people. Not just in milk, everything, all the nutrients they need, right? Now, if I went over to suckler beef, according to the figures supplied by Y University, I will be getting 90 kilos of beef off an acre. And 90 kilos of beef has about a third of the nutrient value of the 1,000 litres of milk that I'm producing an acre. So, although it would admittedly be much less work if I went over to suckler beef production, I will be producing a lot less food off my 10 acres. And I've only got 10 acres and I've got 30 people to feed. Now, this, in effect, is what has been happening. Unfortunately, what's been happening on the 15 million acres of land that is like mine, i.e. it's hilly, It's all grass. There's a bit of a possible arable on it, but it's not rough grazing, but it's the sort of land that you find in the West Country. And what's happened there's 15 million acres of it in Britain. What's happened over the last, 30, 40, 50 years is that the dairy farms, the small dairy farms that have been operating all around where I live and where anybody in the West Country lives are gradually being eliminated one by one. And what's happening? They're either going over to suckler beef or some other beef rearing operation, or they're sold off completely and end up as horticulture or something like that for horses that don't do anything. And what in effect is happened is that as the dairy industry has intensified and moved on to arable land and specialised in producing maize silage and so forth, throwing chemicals, bringing the yield of the cows up to 10,000 litres, from one cow. What I get from 3 cows, they get from 1 cow. It doesn't produce any economies of land at all, because for the 3 reasons that I spoke about. You use just as much land to produce the milk from these Holstein cows as you do if you got quite hardy, dual-purpose, or personally I have Jersey cows on the less good permanent pasture. And so what we've done over the last 50 years is lose hundreds of family farms, undermine the agriculture of the permanent grasslands, made them less productive because it's just beef and horticulture and so forth, and directed it all into these monstrous mega farms that we've already heard about. Now, finally, one other thing I'm thinking of doing, and it involves buying a tractor, is to turn my holding into a mini mixed farm, right? I mean, it's already a mixed farm insofar as I use the manure for an acre of garden. I would have thought that out of a 10-acre holding, with the sort of land I've got, I could just about get an acre and a half of flat land that I could put over to cropping. Now, let's say I put it over to wheat. With that acre and a half of wheat, I could get 2.5 tons of wheat, organic wheat, which is enough nutrients, or calories anyway, to feed 8.5 people. On my 8.5 acres that remain, that's 17 people I'm feeding off my 10 acres. My 10 acres is part of 15 million acres of broadly similar land, and some of it in Wales as well. There's a lot of land in Wales. A lot of it was, with all due respect to Minette, I think it was, a lot of land in Wales was cultivated for grain. And the land around where I am and I have could be. If it were, going up from my farm, it would produce enough food for 17 people on 10 acres. On the 15, that was replicated on 15 million acres, that's 25 million people, which is getting on for half the population on our least good permanent pasture. This permanent pasture is a valuable resource, and at the moment it's being wasted because its best product, which is dairy, is being undermined by these gross factory farms that are in the wrong place. And what those factory farms need to do is to turn into mixed farms where the dairy that they're producing from their wonderful grass is used to fertilize grain for human consumption. That's the way it should go. Let's hope it will. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Really interesting. Now, I think we're going from the very small economies of scale to, the very small scale to the very large scale. Now, Richard, can I first just ask you to give a bit of an outline about Beeswax Dyson farming, so we've all got a bit of a picture of what we're looking at?
Perfect. Well, it's very nice to see everybody today. I'm pleased to be here, first of all. Patrick Holden told me I had to come. So, and of course, when he tells you to come, you have to come. And this followed an inspection of Beeswax Dyson by Patrick to make sure we passed muster. We got away with most things. And so that's why I'm here today. I'm happy to talk about beeswax. So just to do a few numbers, around about 35,000 acres of land, all owned and farmed, 28,000 acres in Lincolnshire, 5,000 acres in Oxfordshire, and 3,500 acres in Gloucestershire. We produce around about 70,000 tonnes of cereals and oilseeds, 15,000 tonnes of potatoes, 45,000 tonnes of sugar beet, 2,000 tonnes of onions, and around about 130,000 tonnes of silage. We employ 150 people. The business is split into 3 sectors. Farming being 66% of what we do, and 66% includes the basic payment, with 29% of turnover is to do with anaerobic digestion, where we're using both energy crops and food waste to produce electricity and heat. A lot of the heat is recycled back into the business, so we're using that for drying grain or drying compost or doing all kinds of things. And I think what we set out to do, I guess, to start with was that this company is only 6 or 7 years old, and we made some fairly significant decisions and assessments at the start. And the first thing was that because we were buying land that we didn't know what we were buying in that sense, so we had no real knowledge of it, we had to try and figure that land out. And much of that land was degraded by farming practices that have been very well described by lots of people before me. So yes, there was too much blackgrass, of course there was. There was 1 or 2 crops. People tended to toss a coin in terms of the rotation. It was either wheat or rape. Some of that land was unfarmable. We had to figure what was going out. And we also had to recognize that there had been degradation of organic matter over time. And then we set out to try and fix it, which I guess I'm going to talk about in a moment.
Thank you. Now, I think it strikes me from the previous speakers, particularly Henry and Simon, that there's a charge against big farms and commercial, conventional farming, that you're doing it all wrong. What would you say in answer to that?
Yeah, absolutely right. Sorry, I've got... Okay, so the first thing to say is that there is no right or wrong. And one of the things we decided was that we would not join any clubs. And a lot of you belong to these clubs, if I'm honest. It might be the pasture-fed club, or it might be the nearly pasture-fed club, or it might be the high-intensity lot, or it might be we can't make up our mind what the hell club we are in club. But nevertheless, we don't want to be in any clubs. And what I'd like to do is let's just make it really simple and call it farming. Okay, very straightforward. And that means doing the right thing in the right place at the right time. And if we think about what's happened with basic payments, and what's happened there is it has encouraged people to do things that the land is not suited to. So first of all, go back to what the land is suited to. It's completely irrelevant whether the farm is large or small or medium. It's about the difference between good and bad.
Thank you. Now, sustainability seems to be a theme coming through. We're particularly interested in climate change today and actions for climate change. What is it that you're doing at Beeswax around climate change specifically? Okay, so if we start off with the basics, we now have 10 crops in Lincolnshire rather than 3. So many of the farms that we bought were growing wheat or rape or perhaps a few peas. We now grow 10 crops. So immediately by growing 10 crops rather than 2 or 3, you get proper diversity within the soil. You immediately start to get rid of blackgrass. You get automatically more fertilizer coming through. And actually, surprise, surprise, yields go up. The rotations historically of, let's say, wheat, rape, no surprise that oilseed rape yields were falling, and no surprise that flea beetle, for instance, was killing rape. One of the speakers this morning said that wheat yields are constantly going up. That's not true. Wheat yields in the UK are at best static, if not actually going down. So if you get the right farming system in the right place, with the right amount of crops, you start to get what I call free wins. You suddenly start to get something for nothing, and you suddenly start to get value from less. And so to describe what we're trying to do is, a lot of people talk about technology, and technology historically in farming has been seen as chemical and fertilizer, and that was definitely the case. But actually technology now can be used to make better decisions, and that might mean more of something, it might mean less of something, but it means you're making intelligent choices rather than, let's say, on some kind of evangelical road trip, which I just don't believe in.
We need facts and we need data. So to give you some idea, I was explaining some of the other day about some of our drones and what they were doing in terms of looking at crops. And they said, well, it's all a bit newfangled and it's all not what farming's all about. I said, it is when you can spot marsh harriers in rye fields when you can't actually see them other way. Beeswax has 15% of the national marsh harrier population on its land in Lincolnshire. They're rarer than golden eagles. We cannot afford to destroy those. So technology, using the drones, putting a geo pin in the land to make sure that when the forage harvester goes anywhere near them, it just cuts out. And that's the kind of technology we need to do. We need to be able to, we talked about Roundup this morning, for instance. People that routinely spraying fields of Roundup to spray the one weed in the corner. Makes no sense at all. Why not just spray the weed in the corner? Use the drones and the technology to do that.
Thank you. And so just on the subject of climate change itself, are you measuring your carbon footprint? And do you think the net zero emissions from agriculture on your holding is feasible, and when will you achieve it, if it is?
Okay, so we're definitely measuring it. We're about 3/4 the way through measuring. We've got our Oxfordshire farms and our Gloucestershire farms to measure yet. We're using the Cool Farm tool to measure our carbon. We've got some early warning signs coming out of that in terms of what our carbon emissions are. So first thing we do is to measure what we're doing. If we look at the things that are causing us problems, it's been mentioned already before, nitrogen fertilizer is a big deal for us. So importing nitrogen fertilizer to grow crops is by far the single biggest contributor. But we're using already over 100,000 tons of manure on Beeswax Dyson farms, and roughly, rough maths, that is about half the amount of carbon that we would be using if we're using nitrogen fertilizer. The other thing that's really significant for us is cover cropping. And there's lots of talk about whether you should cover crop or not. And there's lots of people saying, well, we're still experimenting. We just decided we were going to cover crop big time. So we set ourselves a target of no bare land. If anything was going to be bare land for more than 6 weeks, it absolutely had to have a cover crop. And almost certainly that cover crop had to be grazed by sheep. And so we've introduced, we almost now 9,000 sheep on the farm today, and nearly 3,000 head of cattle as well. So livestock's been introduced back into the business.
So that's on greenhouse gas emission reduction. Thinking more about carbon sequestration, are there things that you're doing to help build the soil carbon, land use change, other crops?
Sure. What we're finding is that the cover cropping is the best way we can sequester carbon for certain. We know that woodland creation over time, new woodland creation, will help us there. In terms of building up organic matter, it's quite an interesting one, organic matter in soil. Because actually, if you get the rotation right and you're adding organic manures right the way through, you will start to build up organic matter in soil. And I think the other thing that's really important is that doing things at the right time and making sure you're not doing things like over-fertilizing and putting on more nitrogen necessarily than the crop wants. There was talk early this morning about it, but one of the biggest single causes, and I was itching to get on the stage earlier on when somebody said, is high yields bad? And I was going to say that, of course, if you set out to grow high yields, and you don't achieve it, you've effectively immediately over-fertilized and you've automatically polluted. So we need to make sure we're targeting that.
So there's a lot that you're doing, clearly. How do you think we can get best practice, not just from what you're doing, but some of the examples, the lessons from organic farming and from small holding? How can we get those lessons out and adopted more widely?
I think that if we thought we were going on some, let's say, single interest crusade and it was all about carbon, then I think we would find it quite difficult. But actually, there is a proper business case here. There's really a proper business case. And if we think about the business case as being how we more closely connect with our customers, we've just started a new direct supply business where we're going to supply customers and householders directly with food. If we capture more value there, we will have a better connection with our customers, almost for certain. So if you've got a better market and you've got a business case and it makes good sense, I think that's the way to sell it rather than to say it's all about one thing singularly.
Yeah. Thank you. I would quite like to keep some time for questions. Is there anything else that you feel that you would like to say to the audience that I haven't managed to pull out of you from my questioning?
I guess having listened to, it's been a great conference. I mean, it is a great conference, and the degree of engagement's great. I think what I would say is that almost for certain, if somebody mentions the idea of a silver bullet to you and the idea that maybe this will fix it, automatically it won't. And that was my message to Michael Gove when I met with him, and we talked about how the answer to everything was, let's say, minimal cultivations and minimal tillage. And I said, not that easy if you're growing potatoes, which need a foot of soil to grow in. So if it's about single interest or single solutions, it's almost certainly wrong. If people are making intelligent decisions and drawing from, whether it's from organic farming or from chemical farming, whatever you want to call it, it's about making that intelligent choice to make the right decision.